welcome to the February 6th, 2025 Land Use and Natural Resources Committee meeting. We'll first start with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you all please join me. Please stand. Salute. Pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
A COVID distance protocol.
Well noted. All right. Could the clerk please call roll?
Yes, directors, when I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bradford. Houlihan.
Here.
Clark Kretz.
Here.
Maple.
Here.
Teeter. Villegas.
Here.
Vice Chair Hume.
Here.
Vice Chair Kozlowski. Absent. Chair Baines.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Moving on to the public communications. This is a time for anyone who wishes to address the board on an item that does not appear elsewhere on the agenda. Is there a member of the public that wishes to make a comment?
There's no public comment.
All right. So now's here we go. Now the last bit for housekeeping before the main agenda, disclosures. Is there any disclosures at the time? This is a time for any director to disclose any conflicts of interest on items on the agenda. Seeing none, we'll move on. We'll now take up the consent calendar. Sorry, asking the clerk here, is there anyone from the public that'd like to remove an item from?
There's no
consent
public
calendar?
comment on the consent calendar.
Anyone from the board wish to remove any items from the consent? All right, we're looking for a motion and a second to approve the consent calendar.
Bradford will move to approve.
Hume, second.
All right, it's been moved in second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. All right, we're now on to action item, agenda item number 2, Land Use and Natural Resources Committee charge. Clint, if you could please take over.
Yeah, I will be fairly brief with this presentation because we'll also dive into much of the guts of what this committee will be doing in the next couple of items. So the charge that you are considering moving along today, it's largely unchanged from last year. The big projects that you'll be overseeing as Lunar is the 2025 blueprint update. This is our final year of that update. So that'll be a big focus of this committee, at least for the first half of this year. We're planning to adopt by November. You also are overseeing, while we don't have current new funding for the Green Means Go program, you're continuing to oversee that program. And as we enter kind of a next phase and we look to see how we can fully fund that program going forward, as well as make sure we're effectively and efficiently kind of executing on the over $50 million in grants that we currently have out that kind of this committee will oversee. So those are two kind of big flagship projects. The committee oversees kind of all of our work having to do with housing and land use. That'll cover a lot of kind of the economic development side of what we do. Air quality, you have some shared responsibilities with the Transportation Committee over air quality and our the requirements that we in our plans and in our program achieve federal air quality standards. So all of that is what kind of is embodied in this committee's responsibilities. A lot of the technical assistance we offer primarily on the land use side of the long range plan implementation is something that you'll see coming to this committee on a regular basis. I won't dive into that during this presentation because Dov is here to talk through kind of all of those services that we offer to working with your local jurisdictions. So with that, I'll stop the presentation on the charge and see if there's any questions or comments on it.
Is there a director that has any questions or comments at this time? Clerk, is there anyone from the public?
There's no public comment on this item.
All right, looking for a motion to approve.
Hume, I'll move. Bradford will second.
All right, it's been moved by Hume, seconded by Bradford. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. I will now move on to the information section of the agenda. The next item of information, item number 3, is a 2025 blueprint update and upcoming milestones. Clint Holston, the SACOG staff, will present this item.
Thank you. Getting my PowerPoint rolling. All right, so going to talk a little bit about where we've been up to this point on the 2025 blueprint, our long range plan update, and then what you can expect coming in this year. So, oops, by way of a little bit of kind of orientation for anybody who's new, but a quick refresher for those of you that have been around for a while. This plan update, we started kind of in a bigger way back in 2022. One of the first things the board did was to adopt a triple bottom line policy framework for the plan update. So those kind of advance these three kind of co-equal goals of advancing equity, economic prosperity, and making sure we're good stewards of the environment as we're doing all of that. So a lot of the research, the discussions, the analysis that we've brought to you about the plan over the last couple of years have been nested in this triple bottom line framework, and you'll continue to see that going forward. The other early step that the board took on this plan was to adopt a set of growth projections for how many people are we expecting, how much growth are we expecting over the next 2.5, 3 decades. This is a little different than what you might see in general plans and things like that that go towards build out. We're looking at how much growth the entire region is likely to see over the next 2.5 decades. And then we have the job of, as a region, figuring out how we can accommodate all of those people, the 280,000 homes, 263,000 jobs that brings with it, and make sure that we're continuing to invest in the 2.5 million people that are already here. So that is kind of the challenge and the opportunity of this plan. Normally these plans happen on a 4-year cycle. We took a little bit longer time. We got some state legislation that allowed us to take an additional 2 years on this plan. That allowed us to do a lot more outreach. So from focus groups to polling, surveys, pop-up workshops, a big regional workshop back in 2022. We were able to hit over 6,000 people with all the outreach we've done, which is more than any of the plans that we've been able to, or that we've updated in the last 20 years, much broader outreach. From all of that emerged these kind of themes of what residents think are important to consider in this plan. I won't go through all of them. Some of them they're consistent. They have been consistent plan over plan, like providing transportation and housing choice to folks. But emerged in this one, and these aren't new concepts, but they kind of are at the forefront of people's minds now, are safety on the transportation system. And that's not just the safety from collisions on the road system, but kind of the perception and feeling of safety when you are getting onto transit or when you are walking or biking in the evenings. So it's an all-encompassing kind of safety element. The other piece that emerged this time that hasn't kind of come to the forefront in the past is this idea of natural disaster preparedness and resiliency. While that's, it's something that we have paid attention to, it's emerged as something that is paramount in the minds of residents. Creating complete communities, that concept is really about making sure that if somebody is moving into a community, that community may have had a school planned, some neighborhood retail planned, and oftentimes it takes a long time for that to be realized. It is paramount in residents' minds that, hey, we moved into this community, we want to see our school built. And so filling out those communities before we start kind of the next increment of growth is another thing that emerged as important. Pathways, I won't spend a ton of time here, but we took a little bit of that additional time that we had to really dig into these kind of potential pathways for growth in the region for the future. We could grow outward, we could see a lot more of our growth kind of in the outlying areas that are planned for growth eventually, or we can kind of really focus on growth in the existing communities. And both of those comes with costs and trade-offs. And so we look kind of stress tested. What happens if you go to extremes on one side and extremes on the other? Typically where we land is somewhere in the middle. It's got to be a balanced approach. And so that is what we did last year is in June. the board adopted its set of land use assumptions. So that is kind of the where and the what type of growth we're going to see for those 550,000 people, 260,000 jobs, 270,000 homes. That was adopted in June. Then we were able to marry up a transportation investment list to that, and the board acted on that in November, which is bringing us into 2025. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about what those two elements, the land use assumptions and the transportation assumptions, actually do. So on the land use side, this is the growth footprint that we're anticipating in this plan. In those blue areas, those are what we consider the existing communities, or areas where we can see more infill. And about 2/3 of the growth in the plan is happening in these areas. That is not inconsistent with what we have seen over the past 5 and 10 years. These are this is the urban footprint. This is where most of that growth, both at jobs and in housing, is happening. The difference between the plan, because this plan doesn't just kind of keep all that going on a status quo, is there's a lot more growth in those infill areas happening in your centers and corridors, your downtowns, your rural main streets, those places that maybe haven't been as quick to catch up with some of the newer growth areas that started in the later 2000s. These are areas that maybe were built for more kind of small commercial development, but they're transitioning now where you have opportunity to bring residential density there, but you don't have the underlying infrastructure like sewer and water necessarily to support all that infrastructure. And that's where programs like Green Means Go that this committee oversees come in to kind of help tear down those barriers and make this growth more feasible in the plan. The other thing the plan does, there's the kind of where all of this growth is located, and then there's the what type. So today the region is predominantly a single family housing home region. There's larger lot, there's small lot, but we also have about a little less than 1/3 of the region is kind of in that attached and smaller lot product. What this plan calls for is to kind of maintain and even increase the share of the smaller and attached products that are available to residents. And you see in the outreach principles or the outreach themes we talked about earlier, that housing choice came up and affordability came up. And while what we heard is a lot of folks, and the majority of folks in the region, still value living kind of in that suburban space where they've got a little bit of elbow room, the neighborhood kind of looks consistent, they've got housing around them. But there's also a lot of recognition that kind of your tastes and your ability to afford that change over time. You may want to live closer to your job when you're younger. You may want to raise family in the suburbs, but you may want to move into something smaller or attached as you're older. But there's also economic realities of, can you afford that larger single family house in the suburbs? Or if we can start introducing kind of a smaller product type, an attached product type, it makes that dream a reality for more people. So that's what we have on the land use side. Another really important note here, I talked housing. On the jobs side, for jobs, I talked about majority of jobs happening or housing happening in those infill areas. That's true of jobs as well. Our biggest job centers are in those areas, and those are going to continue to be powerhouses in the regional economy. But it's also really important that we see job growth in some of the rural communities, in our agricultural lands, in our working lands. And in places that are housing rich. So some of the communities that have built up around job centers, but they're primarily housing. Elk Grove, as an example, has goals to dramatically increase the job opportunities within the city because they're pretty housing rich. So this plan is putting housing where we see job rich areas, and we're putting jobs where we see housing rich areas. And so that's kind of the overarching strategy. On the transportation side, I mentioned this plan is fiscally constrained. So the majority of the funding in this plan, or not majority, the biggest budget category is on maintaining our system. A little over 1/3 of the entire budget is just on maintaining the system of roads, operating our transit system, maintaining our transit system. That is the biggest share. But it's still not enough. We're looking to see additional funding sources coming into the region, but we're still come short by about $300 to $400 million in annual maintenance spending region-wide, when you add everybody up. When we did the call for projects to look at what investments are local agencies looking to include in this plan for the next 25 years, what we got back is about almost $14 billion worth of kind of capital investments. Not all expansion, but capital investments on the road side and on the transit side. We have budget probably for about half of that. So what that means is we got to do a lot with very little money, and not every jurisdiction is getting, no jurisdiction is getting everything that they submitted or everything that they want, because as a region, there just isn't enough money to pay for everything. So this plan really takes a strategy of phasing growth. If we're only growing this much in this area, do we need to build this road or this transit system for build out, or is there kind of a smaller test case that we can do in the near term? For example, light rail expansions tend to be very expensive, and so this plan is prioritizing kind of high quality bus and bus rapid transit in place of light rail if we can bring it on sooner, because it doesn't help anybody to have light rail 20 years in the future if we can have a bus sooner than that, or a really high quality bus rapid transit. So phasing, doing more with less, prioritizing funding to go into the existing system. Even if it's an expansion project, if you're expanding the existing system, oftentimes you're getting a maintenance benefit from that project. So that is really the strategy behind the nearly $40 billion that this plan has for transportation investment. So where are we going next? Starting this year and coming to you next month and in April, we need to start developing the policies and strategies for how we're going to actually achieve all of that. Overcoming the barriers to infill development, especially in those centers and corridors, are big challenges. Overcoming our shortfall on maintenance, those are all really big challenges. This plan calls for a shift in direction, but we've got to have a good set of policies to make that happen. Just as by way of example of kind of how this plan kind of can turn into action, in the 2020 plan, that was the first plan that we introduced tolling or pricing into a regional plan. And we established a policy in that plan to take steps to implement this, make this real within the region. And then just within the last couple of years, we were able to establish CARTA. So now we have the first regional tolling authority in the region. So that's an example of how, it's not the plan that gives all of the momentum, but it's an example of how this plan turns from just a plan to embedding some policies and some actions in it. These are important because they are a call to action in the region. They're also a really important signal to federal and state agencies that pay for the projects in this region and our competitive apps. If we have policies that can align with their policies and speak in the language that they speak, it gives us a leg up in those kind of competitive grant applications. These are all other programs that are good examples of kind of how the plan goes from just plan to implementation. Green Means Go, I've talked about a little bit already. The Ready Set Trails program, 1,000 miles of trail connecting the region. That is an important implementation component of the plan. The Mobility Zones project of kind of bringing equity into the region, but having it be very context sensitive to the communities around the region. These are all good examples of how we take this plan to action. These are the regional examples, kind of the things that SACOG spearheads, but the kind of maybe just as, if not more important, is all the actions that cities and counties take. So this plan is based in your local plans, your general plans, your specific plans, your zoning overlays, all of that. This plan pulls from those and kind of creates a strategic phased plan. So it's really the decisions that happen at city and county and transit agencies that move this plan forward, but we have these programs to assist along the way. The funding round is another one that's coming to you all this year for the state side of the funding round. This will go through the Transportation Committee, but you'll hear about it at the full board. This is where we actually have money to put into the transportation projects. It's about 5% of the total budget represented in the plan, so of that $40 billion plan, but it's a really important 5% that leverages a whole lot of federal and state money. So this is what you've got coming this year. I mentioned in March and in April, we'll have the policy and implementation strategy discussions at this committee. And then in May, we're hoping to be able to release for public review the draft plan and the EIR. Those will be out for 2 months. And then we'll be coming back to you in the fall, hopefully in October, with a kind of status update on here's all the changes that we're proposing to the draft plan. Here's what we heard through the public review period, and then ask you to finally take an action in November to adopt. And we've got kind of a 1 month potential if we need it to fall to December, but we are due to try to hit this in November to meet federal and state deadlines. And I think that is it. So I will stop there and see if there are any comments or questions.
All right, thanks for the presentation. I do have one public comment card or request to speak for Michael Andrew Barnbaum.
And you'll have 3 minutes to speak. I'll give you a 30-second warning.
Thank you, Clint, for the presentation. And I wanted to follow up or piggyback on some matters that were made in the presentation. One is about transportation safety. I was here earlier for the Transportation Committee and mentioned that last year in the city of Sacramento, 32 people passed away from traffic accidents. A vigil was held at Fremont Park as a result of that from a group called Slow Down Sacramento. And their executive director was here today during the Transportation Committee. Thanks to Councilmember Maple, Sacramento has declared this as a transportation emergency and crisis in the city, and it's an emergency. Transportation safety, and none of these deaths should have happened. And so if the region gets together for a measure either June 2nd next year or November 3rd next year, one of the focuses should be transportation safety, that we just don't program it, but we fund it. And if the measure passes, then it can get funded. The other thing I wanted to mention was thank you for bringing up, if we can get a bus somewhere 20 years in advance before a train ever gets there, then great, let's do it. One example is, and I think this is very regional, Santucci Boulevard, Watt Avenue, South Watt Avenue, Elk Grove, Florin Road, which is one road with multiple names traveling through multiple jurisdictions, would be a great candidate for funding service expansion by way of a bus rapid transit line. Service changes and replacements or improvements. One thing I was reminded of this by Council Member Lisa Kaplan. And I remember she talked to both myself and Council Member Maple this to carry the torch on in her absence. Replace the Airport Express 142 because of its redundancy with existing YOLO 42A and 42B, and instead put the resources of canceling the 142 into a route called Route 11, which travels through South and North Natomas, extend it from Club Center Drive and Natomas Boulevard, west along the new Elkhorn Boulevard extension, extending it to Sacramento International Airport, providing 7-day-a-week service. That would be kind of something, doing it at a cost neutral type of way, but it would get a great bus route to the airport well before any light rail line would ever exist to go there. Thank you.
Are there any other public comments?
There's no other public comment.
Any comments or questions from the board at this time? We'll move on to the next item of information is item number 4, land use implementation activities for February of 2025. Dov Caden, staff will present the item.
Good afternoon, committee members. So this is an information item on all of the land use implementation activities that SACOG staff participates on an ongoing basis. So it's an information item today. It's going to be a receive and file item to Lunar and to the full board for the rest of the year, every single month. You just heard from Clint about the 2025 blueprint. I'm going to take us back 20 years to the original 2004 blueprint, which was, of course, a voluntary, foundational planning and visioning process that we underwent as a region to think about how we can grow in a way that increases our quality of life and minimizes pollution as well as congestion. And as part of that process, we adopted a set of blueprint principles. They sound probably very familiar to the 2025 outreach themes that Clint just talked about, but they're housing choice and diversity, transportation options, mixed use, compact development, use existing assets, quality design, and conserving natural resources. And these principles are really integrated into everything that we do here at SACOG. Much of the work that we've done over the last 20 years since we've adopted the blueprint has been oriented around how can we actually implement those principles both in our regional planning processes as well as our local planning processes. So certainly, you know, the more formal SACOG projects and programs like our long-range plan, you know, or our funding round, those are an attempt to implement the original blueprint. This item is a little bit more focused on the whole suite of activities that, you know, we are doing, like letters, outreach, technical assistance, on an ongoing basis in the name of implementing that blueprint, but isn't necessarily, again, attached to, you know, a particular ongoing project or program. And that's because we know that the work doesn't just stop when we adopt the plan, right? Or we award the project. It really requires this intentional follow-through effort, this capacity building component. So in the discussion analysis section of the staff reports for this item, you're always going to see a bullet list of the activities that we've done over the previous month. I'm just going to go through a few of the highlights over the past year, just to give you a sense of the types of services that we can provide you in the interest of our shared goals. So one of the most common things that you're going to see in these items is that SACOG provided what are called MTP-SES consistency letters for a particular housing or mixed-use project. And that comes out of SB 375, which was actually modeled after our original blueprint, helps shape the long-range plan. And that idea is that certain types of housing and mixed-use projects can get environmental review relief or CEQA relief if they meet certain conditions, including being consistent with our MTP-SES. So we offer a service where, you know, if a project applicant or a city or a county you know, wants to confirm whether it is consistent with our plan, we use a worksheet to evaluate the project and then provide a letter to the lead agency and the applicant that the project is indeed consistent with our plan. And it really kind of helps the lead agency make that sort of determination and helps with kind of the streamlining and hopefully full exemption process. And we are one of the state leaders actually in using this CEQA streamlining. Many regions don't use it at all. We're very happy that we use it quite a bit, but we are always trying to kind of advertise that to more of our member agencies just to kind of let folks know that this can be a huge benefit that we can provide. We're continuing our work on the Green Means Go program, of course, to incentivize infill in our locally adopted green zones. You'll see quite a bit of work listed in the staff report under that section, including the Housing Accelerator program that we completed this last year up in Yuba City, Marysville. We hosted a major convening downtown, actually, mostly geared towards our state legislators. I know many of the SACOG board were in attendance for that event this past fall. We've wrapped up work on 60+ regional early action planning grants to local agencies, and then we're continuing our work now on the roughly 25 or so REAP 2.0 grants, our Green Means Go grants. Those are grants to local agencies that cover infrastructure, analysis, engineering, you know, construction that's going to lead to infill development. Another thing that SACOG does is to coordinate and support applications for competitive grant programs that help implement the blueprint. So just an example of that, in 2024, SACOG assisted with potential applicants to the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, the AHSC program. This is one of the premier affordable housing programs that we have in the state now, brings in about $30 million a year to our region. So we hold workshops for that program to kind of gin up some enthusiasm and potential applications to that program. And we also provide direct technical assistance to applicants, most recently to a very cool project in the city of Woodland. Then relatedly, SACOG will also pursue grants ourselves that implement the blueprint. So we did that successfully this past year with the federal Reconnecting Communities Neighborhood Access Program, the RCN grant, brought in about $22.5 million to our region in support of Green Means Go programs at the local level. Directors who were on this committee last year will recall we also applied for the federal Pro Housing Program to support work related to opening up pathways to affordable home ownership. We were unfortunately unsuccessful with that grant, but we were very happy to see that Sacramento County was successful on a $2.7 million proposal for some rezoning and corridor plan work. So congratulations to Sacramento County. We also host events to promote affordable housing more generally. So in September, SACOG partnered with the Sacramento Housing Alliance, SHA, to host a affordable housing tour to discuss some affordable housing projects in the unincorporated county as well as in the city of Roseville. And then we held separately a affordable housing workshop that was a little bit less geared towards elected officials, more towards the local planners to kind of talk through planning and financing needed to build affordable housing in some of our communities. So it was a mouthful, but all of that and actually a bit more in your staff reports you'll see was happening behind the scenes last year in what was a busy year on the blueprint that kind of soaked up a lot of the attention for this committee, but that was all sort of happening behind the scenes. As I mentioned, this is going to be a recurring receive and file item every month for you just to kind of track all the things that SACOG staff are doing to try to implement the land use component of the blueprint. You know, some of those activities are going to be an every month thing. You're almost always going to see an MTP SES consistency letter. Some are going to be a little bit more standalone, more of an ad hoc type of thing, depending on what comes up. Part of what we really just wanted to highlight here today is that we're a resource for you, for your staff, right? We do our best to stay on top of all of the things that we can do to help and all the opportunities. It is a very big region, 28 local governments, right? So, you know, we really benefit from you or your staff reaching out for support. So whenever you come across a project, you know, or an opportunity that you think would really benefit from SACOG providing some assistance, some support, please don't hesitate to reach out, have your staff reach out. I think with that, I'm done. Happy to answer any questions.
All right. Are there any public comments?
There's no public comment on this item.
Any questions or comments from the board? Yep.
Thank you, Chair. Had to find my microphone. Just really, this is really helpful as a brand new committee member and new SACOG board member. This is really helpful overview just to learn about all these. So I'll be looking forward to these on future agendas and just wanted to, you know, put it out to either the, you know, as my district in particular in the city and throughout the region, there's so many opportunities for infill. And so if there's things that we can be doing, please do let me know. And we'll also simultaneously let you know if we have things like projects in our district where we need support. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you.
And Director
Alright.
Mabel, and for all of you, you know, part of what was in Dobbs' presentation, you'll see in your receive and file every month is if it would be helpful, sometimes we know maybe it's not helpful, but sometimes it is to get a letter from SACOG and say, this housing project actually consistent with our regional plan, like the region is behind this and supportive. We do that. If you would like to have us come to your planning commission or your council board, we can do that, right? So the plan means something and we want to be able to implement it.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to follow up on that a little bit. I mentioned it previously, but Dob, your presentation reminded me, and that is, because of all reflected when there's that celebration. So I put that out there because we've had ribbon cuttings in the past where it's just the municipality where it sits in, when in fact, the majority of the work, the energy and the resources came from this body. And it had to go through the approval process. So there's a lot to it. So anyhow, I'll leave it there, but I'm going to raise that again to the bigger board because I do think when projects do take off, we all should know about it so we can celebrate it as a region. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well taken. All right, if there's no other further comment or questions from the board, we're gonna move on to, thank you once again for the presentation. We'll move on to information item number 5, transportation funding overview. Christina. Sorry,
I know, it's a tough one. Svensk.
Svensk.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's good to be at a different committee. I don't come here really ever, so good to see everyone. Thanks. So we're going to talk to you a little bit. Eric and I are going to kind of tag team on this to give you an overview of transportation funding in our region. It's super complicated. We talk about it a lot, but we don't really explain it necessarily as detailed as I think might be useful, especially with 9 new board members and a lot of funding decisions coming your way over the course of the next year and beyond, really. And also not to discount the uncertainty too at the federal level, although we don't have answers on that. I wish we did. Agenda today, just a very quick, we're going to talk a little bit about your role in transportation funding in the region, talk about what's included in the funding, where does the money come from? So we have federal, state, and local sources. And then our formula and competitive funding that we have here at SACOG. So just a quick bit on the board's role in transportation funding. So you'll kind of hear a little bit about this later, but we as an agency have a responsibility for state and federal programs that are both competitive and formula in terms of how they're distributed out. So the board is really here to provide oversight, guidance, feedback, direction, all of that good stuff on how we develop and administer our funding programs and how we distribute our funding to our partner agencies. There's obviously some general assumptions about what the board's role would be, but it is good to note that there is some actual federal and state regulations that are out there that sort of talk about what an MPO and an RTPA need to do in terms of funding and planning. And so the board is really sort of following that as well. So what's included in transportation? We've got cars, we've got freight, transit, walking, biking, technology and programs. You hear a lot about ITS, things that make those things work better on the road. And then of course, maintenance and rehabilitation. Clint just talked about how that's a big part of our blueprint. There's about $1.2 billion annually that comes into the SACOG region for transportation funding. And it's primarily that blue level. We've got regional funding programs, which is about 300 to 350 million. We have our TIP, our Transportation Improvement Program. Those are projects that are programmed into the region. That's 500 to about $1 billion. And then of course, local investments represent about 200 to 500 million. So a lot of money, but from a lot of different directions that it's coming in. I'm gonna pass it over to Eric.
Thanks, Christina. So as Christina mentioned, right, we want this to be an opportunity for you to better understand kind of all the funding that's out there in the transportation space and what that means to SACOG. As you heard, there's billions of dollars, but when you look at the packets here, right, there's not billions of dollars, unfortunately, that you all get to decide on. And so, but we still think it's really important for you to understand where those things are, where you might work with SACOG to go look after those funds, or where you as a local jurisdiction have the ability to compete for funds, either at the state level or at the federal level. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to kind of step back and look at what do we think kind of the total budget is for transportation in the region. And you heard some big numbers from Christina, right? And it's hard to contextualize what that means, but what this pie represents is kind of on an average annual year, the largest share of funding for transportation actually comes from local sources. And that can be Measure A in Sacramento County, but it's also the impact fees that developers are paying. Some cities and counties have portion of their local sales tax they set aside for transportation. So all those things add up to about 39%. The SACOG programs that we'll talk about in a few minutes really represent about 5% of the overall transportation funding. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is walk through federal sources. We've tried to color code these. So blue is federal, orange or yellow is the state, and then the green are the local funds. And happy to answer questions. We've tried to simplify this, but also put in some acronyms because those are what some of the programs are referred to as.
Thank you, Chair. Eric, I just want to kind of unpack this as we go through the slides. Sure. So I understand the full. So that pie there represents the 1 to 2 billion annual. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. And so then what you're saying is that regional, that 5%, the light blue,
Yes.
that represents everything that we're going to go through that is SACOG.
Yeah. So the blue, I guess the regional is orange and blue. So it's both federal and state. So I can explain that a little bit in the slides, right? But SACOG gets about 55 million for our federal competitive programs, and then on an annual basis, and about 20 million, excuse me, a year for the STIP programs. So that's what makes up most of the regional slice in the middle there. And then when we go through these, right, federal, there's some direct funds that come to Caltrans to pay for a state highway system. When you all get a grant from the federal government, that's in the federal wedge, not in the regional wedge. Same on the state, both the gas taxes that flow directly to the jurisdictions, as well as the SB1 grants that you compete for. Those are all kind of considered part of the state share.
So then just to simplify it, maybe oversimplify it.
Okay.
If we say that there's $1 billion that comes to the region.
Right.
And 5% of that, I believe, if I'm doing the math correct, would be 50 million. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So then that 50 million is what SACOG administers within the region that is not just direct pass through. Here's the award to this particular purpose.
So part of why the math is a little bit squishy, and so I think I can unpack your question a little bit, is that we have discretionary grants that shrink and expand over time, and so that makes it difficult to kind of say exactly what the number. So that's why we have a 1 to 2
Okay,
billion.
I'm just talking about a snapshot.
Yeah.
Like this is
So
just a year. If 1 billion comes, 50 million is what would be administered.
So let's say it's about 95 million, right? So you've got the 40 million in the STIP or 20 million in the STIP.
And that would be in sort of that, I don't know even what you'd call that color, but the state 23% wedge?
No.
STIP funds?
The STIP funds are in the regional. And that
Would be in the region?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. Yep.
So help me do the math on that.
Yep.
Because this is why I wanted to stop here is
Uh-huh.
if 1 billion's coming to the region, 5% of that is 50 million. You just said that regional wedge would actually equal 95 million.
I misspoke. It's about 75 million. But it's the 1 to
That
2
still is not 5% of 1 billion.
I think he's right.
Am I-
yeah.
He's simplifying, right?
Yeah, yeah, we're trying to simplify this. This specific graphic here comes out of our long range plan, right, which is looking out over 20 years. And so the aggregate of all of our assumptions for funding.
Okay, I'm gonna try.
Okay,
I'm
go
gonna
ahead,
try,
please.
all right?
Yeah.
You're using 1 billion, but roughly it's 1.4.
Yeah, it varies every year, but at 1
So let's take that and take 5%. That gets you roughly 75.
Okay.
Okay?
So you'd rather use 1.4 instead of 1 billion, but nonetheless,
Well, you're trying to match it
5%
to
is
Eric's
5%.
number.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And that's the federal funding and the STIP that the board's taking action on this month is that 5%.
Fair enough.
Is that okay?
I'll accept your math.
Because you were doing off a billion and Eric was doing on the actuals. And
Yeah.
so,
Which is why I was just saying
Yeah.
hypothetical
Yeah, yeah.
snapshot,
Yeah.
simple zeros, but okay.
All right.
Through the chair, just to follow up with that, I think what I heard and to clarify, our regional funding round that we have, it sounds like we have two, the
Right.
federal one and the state one. Both of those together are the 5%. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, so,
Continue.
yeah, it's all really complicated in the aggregate, right? So we're gonna try to zoom down to the level of like kind of where the SACOG board controls things. But first start out at the federal level, right? Because, what you've heard from us over the past few years is when Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, both names, the exact same thing. They approved about $113 billion a year. And one of the things that is a big change is they really increased the amount of competitive funding. However, as you see here on the Federal Highway Administration or FHWA side, they increased it from almost no competitive programs to 13% competitive programs. And so the point of this is to illustrate, yes, we do have a lot of funding at a national level that we should rally together and go seek funding for. But there's also a lot of that funding that comes to Caltrans, the state highway system, and other programs that Caltrans controls. And then there's that 55 million in funding that comes through to SACOG to administer for the federal programs. And then on the transit side, Federal Transit Administration mostly funds states and transit agencies on formula. So about half of it's formula, and then the other roughly half is for competitive grants. So if, for instance, SAC-RT, a lot of their light rail expansion programs over time, right, they compete and go after funding and win awards to fund those major capital improvements, and they have to compete nationally for those. So when you zoom down on the still staying on federal, right, but the federal money that comes to California out of that 113 billion, you're looking at nearly $9 billion. That's just for California, because when Congress set this up, they set up a bunch of formulas and said it comes to states on these particular formulas. And so the share for the highway funds, starting at the top, Caltrans gets about $3.5 billion that they use for maintenance, operation, improvement of the state highway system, and bridges, lots of things like that. And then MPOs like SACOG get a portion based on their population after Caltrans takes some off for the areas that are more rural in the state. And that trickles down to the 55 million that I've been talking about. So the most flexible is the STBG, or Surface Transportation Funds. They're also called the RSTP, Regional Surface Transportation Program in California, for no reason other than that Caltrans wanted to have a different name for the same thing. But so in aggregate, we've got $55 million in our federal programs there. And then going down to the next row there, right, we've got regional grants and local grants. So the Mobility Zones program is a federal grant that SACOG applied and competed nationally, got money to help pay for that work we've got. There's also lots of grants like Capital Southeast Connector and others who, won these grants recently from the federal government to fund projects in the region. And that, so you got 55 million, the SACOG controls, and on average, going back over the last several years, about the same amount we've won in competitive grants. So we're doing pretty good there. And then if you go down to the transit side of things, there's our state overalls where we have kind of the total. The state's won about $1 billion in competitive grants on an annual basis. And then we, working with RT in the urbanized area, and then the other transit agencies have formula funding that comes to the region for transit.
So again, just
Yeah.
so I can make sure that I'm tracking
Sure.
how things move from this slide to
Yes.
the next slide.
Uh-huh.
Everything represented on the previous slide and on the slide that's up there right now
Yes.
is this 12% federal.
That's right. Plus part of the 5% wedge for regional. And that's what's trickled down here. So, right, so because the 12% for the federal wedge, that is just that's what stops kind of at the state agencies, the 3.5 billion. So that we would count as a federal portion. The competitive grants, right, SACOG doesn't have control, so that's in the 12% for federal. And then the competitive FTA grants, that would be in the 12% federal. But the transit related funds, we would consider those part of the regional.
And that's because of the 12% discretionary?
The 12% discretionary is what we control.
Okay. So that would be in the regional, but the rest of this would be in the federal.
Right. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
So this is the same last column, but kind of turned on its side to just break it out. And Christina will talk in a little bit about the programs that we have on the federal side, right? But they come to us in these different colors of money, we call them, right? And so, as I mentioned before, the first two represent our main federal funding program that's now a 6-county program. Carbon reduction is a new program that was started up in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or bipartisan infrastructure law. We've funded some of our trails work from that. And then the transit funds we've talked about. So again, as I mentioned earlier, about 50-50 competitive grants that we've won relative to the discretionary funds that just flow through us by formula. So I can move on now to the state side of things. So first, starting at the high level, California collects a lot of different revenue sources that all fund transportation. So contrast to the federal level, where you largely have the federal gas tax and general funds from Congress that pay for transportation. Here in California, right, we've got multiple different fuel tax sources, electric vehicle charges, sales tax at the state level, truck weight fees, all those things pay for transportation. But California kind of expands the pie and has CHP, DMV, other transportation adjacent things funded in transportation. And so a bit harder to do kind of the, how does the money trickle down? Because a lot of it stays at the state level here. But if we do want to go kind of zero in, this next slide here is zeroing in on the SACOG region. And so what we're trying to represent here is what funding flows directly to Caltrans that stays with Caltrans, but benefits our region. And so we've talked about the STIP, or the State Transportation Improvement Program, that SACOG controls. Before that formula flows down to SACOG at the California Transportation Commission, they take off a portion to pay for the interstate TIP, the Interregional Transportation Improvement Program, right at the top there, right? So projects within District 3 get those funds to pay for improvements on the state highway system. They also have the State Highway Operations Program, the SHOP, that pays for the maintenance of the highways in our region. So those two are in the very top row there. And then SACOG, as the regional transportation planning agency for the 4 counties, has some transit related funds that total 125 million. The STIP that we've talked about, on an annualized basis, it's 20 million. In a couple weeks at the board, you'll hear about the STIP recommendations, and we're going to say 42 million at that point. That's because it's a 2-year program. And then finally, we have these one-time funds for SB 125, which is the Transit Relief and Recovery Program. So it's a multi-year thing, but the legislature approved it one time. And so we're making an expenditure plan over a few years for that. And then finally, but importantly, want to highlight that you as cities and counties get direct funding from the state government as opposed to the federal government, that you don't get it direct into your general fund through the state gas taxes. And then the very last row here is on discretionary grants. So those SB 125 grants that you compete for at a statewide level are all in here. So just like with the federal, if you kind of turn that last row on its side, you see the rough distribution of things. So we have a lot of transit related funds. In some counties, they're a little bit more flexible, that are on the far left there. Our STIP and SB 125 is where we have discretion and competition. And then you all get your direct funding. And then you also have gone out and competed for statewide funds, which is, roughly 50% to the 50% of what you get by formula through that specific program. And then the final, before I turn it back over to Christina, is on the local side. So I mentioned Measure A earlier and others. Transit fares are a small but important part of what local funding is available to pay for transportation for transit agencies. And then the really varying level of funding for impact fees and assessments based on different, conditions over time can vary from anywhere to $100 to $300 million a year. With that, I'll hand it back over to Christina.
Okay. I hope you're all following along. I know it's a lot. So looking a little bit more at our regional programs. So drilling into kind of the ones that we administer. We have our 6-county competitive program. This is those guidelines that we all worked for the last 2 years to put together for the new 6-county funding program that we're going to administer. So as Eric mentioned, that's about $55 million on an annual basis. Also as part of that, there's the priority programs. These are Engage, Empower, Implement, our sustainable mobility program, 2 air quality related programs that we have, Spare the Air and CCAT. And then 2 new ones that you all approved as part of the guidelines for the new funding round, which is the pavement management program, to help everybody kind of get on the same page with what their pavement conditions are like, so we can better allocate out maintenance related dollars to the region, as well as freeway service patrol. So having a more kind of coordinated effort and a source of funding to make sure that we have that in working order the way it should. Eric mentioned carbon reduction program. That is a few years worth of funding. We just administered our first competitive program of that, where we focused on awarding projects for zero emission projects, as well as implementing our trails plan. We plan to do another round of that in maybe a year or 2, also implementing the trails plan, but also projects coming from the Mobility Zones project. So those are the main federal ones. On the state side, just at Transportation Committee, we talked a lot about STIP. The Transportation Committee move forward with a recommendation to the board on a budget for the first state funding program that we're going to administer, also part of that 2-year-long process to develop a new state program. This represents the funding that is estimated on an annual basis to each of the counties, which is the new kind of structure that we're looking at doing. As well as setting aside a portion for competitive set aside. If you remember all those discussions we had during that process, there was a lot of support for having a portion of the state funding put aside to support a regionally significant project that illustrated partnerships or just had some sort of regional impact. So you'll be hearing about that and what their recommendation was at the board meeting in a few weeks. And then, of course, there's the active transportation program. We're about to announce some awards from our most recent. The funding for that varies. As you know, this last round was significantly lower than what we had seen before. We hope it comes back to where it was before, but this one is very much out of our control, but still getting dollars out the door through a competitive program for those dollars as well. So this is where we start to talk about what have we put out the door. So after this is over a 20-year period, and you can see the dark green at the bottom, that's Sacramento County. This shows just being the largest county we have in our region. This shows the funding through our programs that have gone out to Sac County. And then the lighter green at the top is the remainder of the 3 counties. Just a reminder, this is the 4 counties only, not inclusive of Placer and El Dorado. So one of the things with this STIP that we've been talking a lot about, and again, you'll hear in 2 weeks, is a concept of how the STIP shares are calculated. And that is vehicle miles and population. It's about 75% population, 25% lane miles to come up with that. So for Sac County, it's about 74% of the STIP funding is what they should receive. So if you look over time, over the last 20 years, that's about what has gone out to the County of Sacramento. It goes up and down as it should, because there's nothing static in life. It's going to ebb and flow, but over time, over the last 20 years, it's maintained about 73%. So we're kind of on track with what population and lane miles would do. What's really important about the population and lane miles calculation, if we focused only on population, all of the money would go to our urban areas. By factoring in the lane miles, it sort of evens it out and gives a more reasonable proportional allocation towards our rural partners like Yuba, Sutter, and Yolo as well. So we can go even farther down this rabbit hole and look at what this looks like for each of the counties. So on the left, again, you have that population and lane miles pie, and on the right, you have our grant awards from SACOG that have gone out. And you can see they align pretty well over the last 20 years. So I think we're doing pretty good in a region if you want to start to talk about distribution. Yep.
So Christina, just, and apologize for my simplicity here.
Of
When you
course.
say, like, for example, the counties, you're talking about the total amount of money that went into the counties, including the cities that are in the, right? Okay,
Correct.
so it's not
Yes.
just the, I figured, I just want to clarify. that, 'cause
yeah,
I got it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to break it down, but the way CTC does the shares, it's county.
Understood, but I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure
Yep.
we're all hearing the same thing.
Yep. There we go. All right. So we've talked a lot about the funding. Now, some of those funds that we've talked about can go towards transit, but as Eric mentioned, there's also some dedicated transit funding. So we do have some FTA funding that flows to us as well as some state funding. So on the competitive side, about $5 million a year, which is that 12% discretionary that Director Hugh mentioned, that is competitive from FTA that we administer as SACOG to our transit agencies in the region. There is also the state SB 125. That has been about $60 million a year. That is a 3-ish year program for the bulk of it. There's some residual years with some residual funding. We have administered 2 allocation plans already. I'm sorry, I think it's 5 years, and are about to administer another. We're starting the process now to have another allocation plan come before you this spring to get another tranche of money out. And that's available for operating primarily, but also capital projects. And we've used it for both in our responding to the needs of our partner agencies in the region that operate transit. On the formula side, the remainder of that FTA money, 88% of it is going formula. We're passing through to our transit agencies directly for operating and capital. There's state sources, TDA, Transportation Development Act, STA, state transit assistance, and SGR, state of good repair funding. Those are all for operating and or capital, depending on which source. And you can see what the totals there are. And again, SACOG is just the pass-through for those, and those go to the agencies themselves.
Director Hume, can I go back one sec? So to your question earlier, I think it was about the competitive funding for FTA funds. That's the 12% there. And that's, so the MOU that you're going to be hearing about this year, that's the 1288.
So kind of wrapping back up where we started with the board's role in transportation funding. So it's super complicated, but you play a very important role in how it goes out to all of your agencies. So, you know, we are navigating some new things. It's going to be an interesting year, not just because, like I mentioned, the uncertainty at the federal level, but we do have our first ever 6-county funding round. We've never done that before in this way. There is going to be some interesting steps, some interesting learnings that we're going to see from this. But I think with the help of the working groups of the last 2 years, and the board really was super pivotal in making that be a successful thing. So we appreciate that. So that feedback, that guidance, that direction, that's what we're kind of looking for. And I think it's just good to remember, you know, these are public dollars. We have a responsibility to make sure that these public dollars are used in the most efficient and effective way possible. And so you really are kind of that like beacon of light and guiding light for what we can and can't do here with the funding and how we should be doing it. That is reasonable for the region, because everybody has different needs and everybody has different priorities, and yet we still have goals that we have to achieve. So it's balancing that. And so really providing guidance and feedback on that is going to be really critical, not just over the next few years, but as long as we are here. So hopefully this has been informative, helpful. There's a lot of funding decisions that will be coming your way. So the goal is that this has provided you with a good foundation to understand the flow and what you're going to be kind of thinking about. Happy to answer any questions.
All right, clerk, is there anyone from the public that wishes to comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Are there any additional questions or comments from the board?
Thank you, Chair. I did have one additional question, and I don't want to get into weeds too much on it, but I'd just like to understand it. And if it's something that's easier to take offline, I'm happy to do that. But in the pie chart that talks about the population and lane miles versus the grant awards, can you tell me in a quick fashion what the formula is for population and lane miles and how we arrive at that number?
Yeah, that is from the state, and that is 75% population, 25% lane.
Director Hume, and for everybody, Tina said this morning, thank you, took action on the 4 county STIP. So county by county STIP is brand new. Transportation Committee landed on a 10% pooled share across the top. That was unanimous recommendation. Those funds are divided up using that formula. So that's the CTC published formula. And we had this discussion, Director Hume, it's a little bit trying to take into account sort of heavily populated areas versus areas of not just the counties, but districts, right? That have a lot of roads, a lot of crumbling roads and not a lot of population. So that's what it's trying to do. And it's the closest that we can find since we're putting all the STIP money out by that formula. It's sort of the state's formula on fair share.
All right. Last chance for any questions or comments from the board?
I have one. I just noticed El Dorado and Placer were not on the pie chart. I was just wondering about that.
That, I think a lot of that is.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I figured.
Did- The pie chart that he was just referring to,
They'll be on there soon.
yeah, we don't administer state funding for them because they are their own RTPAs. The federal government doesn't really recognize RTPAs, so we are the MPO for 6 counties, but state money does recognize RTPAs. So Placer and El Dorado deal with their own STIP. We just deal with it for the 4 counties. So that's why on that detailed slide, they're not there.
SACOG's the 6 counties. That's why I just
Yes.
wondered about that.
All right. Okay, well, Christina and Eric, thank you. Thank you very much. It was very helpful and informative. So that was our last item on the agenda. We're gonna move on to other matters.
Nobody asked about how do we hold on to federal funding? That was the big topic this morning is what do we do about federal funds and how do we keep them flowing to California? But if you don't have questions on it, you figured it out.
Those are for another day.
I just say what we said this morning, which is at the moment, nobody has a crystal ball. However, in May, I hope you go to cap because I actually think this is going to be a very important cap trip. And it shouldn't be the only time you visit DC or meet with your members of Congress. It's never been more important than we have a united 6-county region. The fact that we have members on both sides of the aisle in our delegation across 6 counties should be an asset right now. So we know that our delegation has been able to work together, especially on infrastructure projects. So we got to support them 100%. Exactly what's going to happen and is California going to be eligible and competitive and will we lose out on funding? We can't tell you that yet, right? But what we do know is we'll be much better off if we hang together across the 6 counties, across the aisle. So see you in DC in May. Some of you. You have a good excuse.
All right, well, this is the time of members, other board get a chance to bring up any matters of interest or.
I have something. This coming Tuesday and Wednesday, Caltrans invited me to a State Route 12 and State Route 160 safety audit workshop. It's long overdue because there's carnage on those highways all the time. So, I mean, I saw near misses just in Ileton at 160 and 2nd and A Street. So that's what it is.
And I'll just say, since this is transportation related, if somebody wants to go to this town called Clarksburg, I'm not exactly sure where it is. But there will be a Caltrans meeting tonight on the closure of the Paintersville and Ileton bridges.
Yeah, I deal with that all the time. Coming to work here.
All right, there's no further questions or updates. Land Use and Natural Resources Committee meeting is now adjourned. All right, the next lunar meeting will be held on Thursday, March 6th 2025 at 1:30 PM here, SACOG's board.